Good night. I'm going to continue with the martyrs under Nero, the saints that I've already written in my book, which won't complicate me when I come to uploading it because they're already written down, as if I'd done them and I haven't. It is the Lives of the Saints by Butlers, and I'm beginning with the date on the top of here is the 24th of June, and the saints will be the martyrs under Nero, Saint Simplicius, Bishop of AUTUN, well, when I get to it, and Saint Simplicius, Saint Bartholomew of FARNE, and I'll go through them as I get to them, is the best way. So I'll begin right away because I have to give this book back before I can take out the next one for July, and tomorrow's the 1st of July. So I'm just going to try and do as many as I'm able, as I've written down in this book, and backtrack and see if I've missed any. I can see they're not done yet, and those dates were about the 28th. Saints Plutarch, none, I don't know any of these. Saint Paul the First Pope, AD 707. I actually know none of them, so if I do get a moment, I'll flip back over, see what I've missed, and try and record them as well. Otherwise it will be next year if I'm still alive. Oh dear. So I'm now going to begin the lives of the saints, and these saints are the martyrs under Nero, AD 64. I hope the microphone is working properly. These confessors, whose number and names are known only to God, are described in the Roman Martyrology as the first fruits with which Rome, so fruitful in that seed, had peopled heaven. It is interesting to note that the first of the Caesars to persecute Christians was Nero, perhaps the most unprincipled of them all. In July 64, the 10th year of his reign, a terrible fire devastated Rome. It began near the Great Circus, in a district of shops and booths full of inflammable goods, and quickly spread in all directions. After it had raged for 6 days and 7 nights, and had been got under by the demolition of numerous buildings, it burst forth again in the garden of Tigellinus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and continued for 3 days more. By the time it had finally died down, 2/3 of Rome was a mass of smouldering ruins. On the 3rd day of the fire, Nero came from Antium to survey the scene. It is said that, clad in theatrical costume, he went to the top of the tower of Maecenas, and to the accompaniment of his lyra recited Priam's lament over burning Troy. His savage delight at watching the flames gave rise to the belief, he must be mad then, he had ordered the conflagration, or at any rate had prevented it from being extinguished. The belief rapidly gained ground. It was said that flaming torches were thrown into houses by mysterious individuals who declared themselves to be acting under orders. How far Nero was responsible remains a moot point to this day. In view of the numerous destructive fires which have afflicted Rome throughout the ages, it is more than likely that this perhaps was the worst of them all, was due to accident. It is more likely. At the time, however, suspicion was so widespread that Nero was alarmed and sought to divert it from himself by accusing Christians of setting fire to the city. Although, as we now know from the historian Tacitus, no one believed them to be guilty of the crime, they were seized upon, exposed to the scorn and derision of the people, and put to death with the utmost cruelty. Some were sewn up in the skins of wild beasts and delivered to hungry dogs, who tore them to pieces. Some were crucified. Others again were smeared over with wax, pitch, and other combustible material, and after being impaled with sharp stakes under their chins, were ignited to serve as torches. Weren't they evil? All these barbarities took place at a public nocturnal fete which Nero gave in his own gardens. They served as sideshows, whilst the emperor diverted his guests with chariot races, mixing with the crowd in plebeian attire, or driving himself in a chariot. Hardened though the Romans were to gladiatorial shows, the savage cruelty of these tortures aroused horror and pity in many of those who witnessed them. The saint at the top here is called Saint Simplicius, Bishop of Autun, 4th or 5th century. Except that he was Bishop of Autun, highly esteemed for his integrity and charity, nothing definite is known about this Saint Simplicius. He would seem to have succeeded Bishop EGMOND about the year 390. On the other hand, it is possible that he was the Bishop Simplicius mentioned by Athanasius as one of the signatories to the decrees of the Council of Sardica in 347. According to his legend, as related by Gregory of Tours, he came of a distinguished Gallo-Roman family and married a maiden young and wealthy like himself, with whom he made a pact that they should live in continence and devote themselves to good works. After Simplicius had been elected bishop, misunderstanding arose, and some scandal was caused in the still largely pagan city because the new prelate and his wife continued to dwell under the same roof. To vindicate themselves, they voluntarily submitted to an ordeal by fire. They took red-hot coals, laid them in the folds of their clothing, and stood up before the people for an hour, without sustaining any injury to themselves or to their garments. So convincing was this miracle that it led over 1,000 pagans to seek baptism. Another wonder, and one equally fruitful in conversions, was wrought by Saint Simplicius on the day of the goddess Cynthia, which was always an occasion for disgraceful orgies. The holy bishop met the statue of the deity as it was being conveyed in a chariot to bless the fields, and with a prayer for divine assistance, he upraised his hand to make the sign of the cross. Instantly the image fell to the ground, from which no efforts could dislodge it. Moreover, the beast which drew the chariot refused to proceed any further. Saint Bartholomew of FARNE, A.D. 1193. Of the many pious men who were led by the example of Saint Cuthbert to become solitaries on the island of FARNE, off the Northumbrian coast, not the least remarkable was this Bartholomew, for he spent no less than 42 years upon that desolate haunt of birds. He was a North Countryman, a native of Whitby. His parents, who may have been of Scandinavian origin, called him Tostig, but because the name made him a laughing-stock, it was changed to William. He determined to go abroad, and his wanderings led him to Norway, where he remained long enough to receive ordination as a priest. He returned home and went to Durham, where he took the monastic habit, assuming the name of Bartholomew. A vision he had of St. Cuthbert inspired him to dedicate the rest of his life to God in the cell which Cuthbert had once occupied at FARNE. Upon his arrival, he found another hermit already installed, a certain brother Ebwin, who strongly resented his intrusion and who strove by petty persecution to drive him away. Bartholomew attempted no reprisals, but made it quite evident that he had come to stay, and Ebwin eventually retired, leaving him in solitary possession. The mode of life he embraced was one of extreme austerity, modelled upon that of the fathers in the desert. Later, he was joined by a former prior of Durham called Thomas, but they could not agree. Their chief cause of dissension, sad to relate, was the amount of the food ration. Thomas could not manage with as little as Bartholomew, and he went so far as to question the genuineness of what appeared to be his brother's extraordinary abstemiousness. Bartholomew, who seems to have been sensitive to criticism, was so offended at being charged with hypocrisy that he left the island and returned to Durham. There he remained in spite of the apologies of Thomas until the bishop a year later ordered him back to FARNE. When a reconciliation took place, forewarned of his approaching death, Bartholomew announced it to some monks who were with him when he died, and buried him in the island. He left a reputation for holiness and miracles, but there is no evidence of liturgical cultus. Now to the 25th of June. I'm just going to check with what I've written here, just to make sure it's already written down. So that was Bartholomew, and then with St. William of Vercelli. Yes, I've got that down. He was the abbot of Monte Vergine, 1142. So I will continue. The founder of the religious congregation known as the Hermits of Monte Vergine came of a Piedmontese family and was born at Vercelli in 1085. After the death of his parents, whom he lost in infancy, he was kindly cared for by relations, but at the age of 14 he abandoned his home and set out as a poor pilgrim for Compostela in Spain. Not satisfied with the hardships such as a journey entailed, he had 2 iron bands fastened round his body. How long William remained in Spain is not recorded. We hear of him next in 1106, when he was at Melfi in the Italian Basilicata, and then at Monte Solicoli, on the slopes of which he remained for 2 years, leading a penitential life with a hermit. To this period belongs St. William's first miracle, the restoration of sight to a blind man. The cure made him famous, and to avoid being acclaimed as a wonder worker, he left the neighbourhood to stay with St. John of MARTYR. They were kindred spirits and became close friends. It was St. William's intention to proceed on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he would not allow himself to be deterred by John's assurance that God had other work for him to do. He actually started, but he had not got far when he was attacked by robbers. He took this as a sign that John was right and relinquished his journey. He now betook himself to a height between Nola and Benevento, which was then called Monte Vergiliano, possibly after the great Virgil, who is said to have sojourned there. At first, William attempted to live there as a hermit, but he was soon joined by would-be disciples, both priests and laymen. He formed them into a community, and from the church which he built in 1124, under the name of Our Lady, the mountain has derived its present name of Monte Vergine. The rule he instituted was most austere. No wine, meat, or dairy produce was allowed, and on 3 days of the week only vegetables and dry bread. After the first fervour had cooled, murmurs arose, and there was a general demand for relaxation. William had no desire to constrain the malcontents, though for himself any relaxation seemed unthinkable. He therefore chose a prior to rule the community, and then departed with 5 faithful followers. With St. John of MARTYR, who now joined him, he made a second settlement at Monte Lassino in Apulia. Here, however, the barrenness of the soil, the exposed position, and the high altitude made life a misery to all but the most hardy, and even they could with difficulty hold out through the winter. St. John had more than once urged removal when a fire, which destroyed their huts, compelled them to descend into the valley. There are two holy men parted. There the two holy men parted. John to go east and found one monastery at Pulsano on Monte Gargano, and William to found another on Monte Cognato in the Basilicata. When that community was well established, St. William treated it as he had treated the monastery at Mount Vergine. He gave it to a prior and left it to govern itself. At Conza in Apulia, he founded a monastery for men, and at Guglietto, near Nusco, he established two communities, one of men and the other of women. King Roger II of Naples, excuse me, my book is slipping away from me that I'm leaning this on. At Conza in Apulia, I've said that, he established two communities, one of men and the other of women. King Roger II of Naples afterwards drew him to Salerno in order that he might have the benefit of his counsel and help. St. William's beneficent influence over the monarch was, however, resented by some of the courtiers, who lost no opportunity of discrediting and decrying him as a hypocrite and a humbug. With the knowledge of the king, they set a trap by sending to him on some specious excuse a woman of loose life, charged with the task of luring him to sin. What's the bet she becomes a nun, eh? William received her in a room at one end of which a great fire was burning. And as soon as she began to exercise her blandishments, he walked to the fireplace, parted the glowing coals with his bare hands, and then stretched himself down at full length in the space he had cleared, inviting her to lie down with him. Her horror was only exceeded by her amazement when he presently arose, completely unharmed. The miracle led to her conversion. She gave up her life of sin and took the veil in the convent of Venosa. I hadn't read that. Honestly, I just guessed. As for King Roger, he continued to patronize William's foundations and endowed other houses which he placed under the saint's control. St. William died at Guglietto on June 25th, 1142. He left no written constitutions, but a code of regulations, bringing the order into conformity with the Benedictine rule. It was drawn up by the third abbot, General Robert. The only monastery of William's foundation which exists at the present day is that of Monte Vergine. It now belongs to the Benedictine congregation of Subiaco and has a much venerated picture of Our Lady of Constantinople, to which pilgrimages are frequently made. So the next saint coming up is Saint Febronia, Virgin and Martyr, AD 305. Yes, she's here. Continuing. It must be frankly admitted that the Virgin Martyr Saint Febronia is in all probability a purely fictitious personage, but she's venerated by all the churches of the East, including that of Ethiopia, and in the West by such towns as Trani in Apulia and Patti in Sicily, which claim to possess some of her relics. She is supposed to have suffered at Nisibis in Mesopotamia somewhere about the year 304 in the persecution under Diocletian. No genuine records of her life and passion are available, but the legend attributed to her survives in the form of an attractive romance purporting to have been written by Tomal Mays, a nun of her convent, who is said to have witnessed the events she describes. Only a mere outline of the story can be given here. Febronia, as a child of 2, was placed by her parents under the charge of her aunt, Raiini, who ruled a convent of nuns at Nisibis. There she grew up, lovely in body and in soul, in ignorance of the outside world, and intent only upon adorning herself with virtues to fit her for her heavenly bridegroom. Hang on, just trying to turn this page. Raiini took great pains with her education, and in order to guard her against the temptations likely to assail her, she allowed her niece food only every other day, and made her sleep upon a narrow plank of wood. So well did Febronia profit by the instructions she received, that when she was 18, she was set to read and expound the Holy Scriptures to the nuns every Friday. Great ladies from the town also attended these readings, but Raiini veiled her from their sight, lest their attention should be distracted by Febronia's amazing beauty, and also because the girl had never seen anyone but her fellow nuns. The peaceful life of the convent was brought to a sudden termination by the outbreak of persecution. Oh yes, I forgot to note Virgin and Martyr, so I wonder if they killed her in the end. Okay. At Nisibis, the cruel edicts of Diocletian were enforced with great ferocity by the prefect Selenus. The clergy, together with their bishop, took refuge in flight, and their example was followed by all the nuns, with the exception of Raiini of Febronia, who was recovering from a serious illness, and of Tomaeus. When the prefect's officials came to search the convent, they did not trouble to arrest the 2 old women, but they carried off Febronia. The following day, she was brought up for trial, and Silenus told his nephew, Lysimachus, to cross-examine her. This the young man proceeded to do courageously and somewhat diffidently, for he was the son of a Christian mother, and all his sympathies were with the prisoner. Silenus interrupted him impatiently, and prompted perhaps by a touch of malice, he offered to give Febronia liberty and wealth if she would renounce her religion and consent to marry Lysimachus. She replied that she had treasure in heaven, not made with hands, that she was already espoused to an immortal bridegroom, and possessed a dowry which was the kingdom of heaven. Infuriated by her reply, Silenus ordered her to be stripped, to be fastened to 4 posts over a slow fire, and to be scourged. 17 of her teeth were then pulled out, and her breasts were cut off, regardless of the indignant protests of the crowd that filled the courthouse. As the martyr survived all these tortures, her limbs were lopped off, and she was finally dispatched by blows from an axe. Retribution promptly overtook Silenus. In a sudden fit of madness, he struck his head against a marble pillar and fell down dead by order of Lysimachus. Febronia's remains were then reverently gathered up, and she was given a magnificent funeral. Her martyrdom led immense numbers of pagans to seek baptism, amongst them Lysimachus, who became a monk in the days of the Emperor Constantine. The next saint on here is Saint Gallicanus, A.D. ? next to 352. There was a Gallicanus who was an illustrious Roman patrician, and possibly a great benefactor to the Church in the 4th century. He was not, however, a martyr, as is asserted in the Roman Martyrology. In all probability, he was the Gallicanus who was consul with Symmachus in 330. A record has been preserved in the Liber Pontificalis of the generosity of Gallicanus to the Church of Saints Peter, Paul, and John the Baptist, which Constantine had built at Ostia. Amongst his donations were a silver crown with dolphins weighing 20 pounds and a silver cup or chalice with bas-reliefs weighing 15 pounds. He also endowed the church with 4 landed estates. This is all that is actually recorded of the patrician of that name. Despite the abnormally long notice accorded to him in the Roman Martyrology, his reputed acts are spurious. They are a late compilation and abound with anachronisms and inaccuracies. According to them, Gallicanus was a great general who, in the days of Constantine, routed first the Persians and then the Scythians in 2 victorious campaigns. Whilst he was engaged in the second expedition, he was converted to Christianity by the brothers of Saints John and Paul. Retiring from Rome, Gallicanus settled down at Ostia. He built a church, liberated his slaves, and enlarged his house to make it a hospice for pilgrims. In all his good works, he was assisted by a companion named Hilarinus. His fame, we read, spread throughout the world, and men came from the east and from the west to see the ex-patrician and ex-consul, the friend of the emperor, washing the feet of pilgrims, laying the table, pouring water on their hands, ministering to the infirm, and generally giving as an example of sublime virtue. These activities are supposed to have been brought to an end by Julian the Apostate, who commanded Gallicanus to sacrifice to the gods or go into exile. The saint chose banishment and withdrew to Egypt, where he joined a group of hermits. Persecution, however, followed him even into the desert, and he was beheaded, while his friend Hilarinus was scourged to death. There is some small writing, but I'm not able to read it. So the next saint on here is Saint Prosper of Aquitaine, and there's another Saint Prosper at the bottom, Bishop of Reggio, but they've both got different dates. Saint Prosper of Aquitaine is CAD 465. Saint Prosper, Bishop of Reggio, is AD 466. But this 465 has got no question mark. But that one there, 466, has a question mark. So I will continue. Saint Prosper of Aquitaine, whose feast is kept at Tarbes as the Aquitanian doctor, is well known in his writings, but little known in his life, though there are several ancient references to him as learned and holy and the like. He was neither bishop nor priest. The Roman Martyrology calls him Bishop of Reggio by confusion with another Prosper, which is underneath, below. He seems always to have been a layman, possibly married, a point not settled by the disputed attribution to him of a poem from a husband to his wife, expressive of trust in God, whatever befalls. Prosper went from Aquitaine into Provence, and from Marseille in 428 wrote, at the instance of his friend Hilary, to St. Augustine at Hippo. The matters raised drew from St. Augustine his treatises concerning predestination and concerning the gift of perseverance, and Prosper thus became involved in the semi-Pelagian controversy opposing St. John Cassian and perhaps St. Vincent of Lerins. Prosper and Hilary went to Rome and returned with a letter from Pope St. Celestine I to the bishops of Gaul, praising the real zeal of the bearers and calling for peace. I must have a sip of drink. Excuse me a moment, please. Thank you. But the disputes continued. Prosper eventually went again to Rome, where he is said to have been secretary to Pope Leo the Great. He died there sometime after 463, but at the top it says 465, so there must be some reason for that. The writings of Prosper of Aquitaine, whether in verse or prose, are mostly concerned with the controversy about grace and free will in defence of St. Augustine's doctrine. His longest poem is a dogmatic treatise of 1002 hexameters, a song about the graceless. But the most widely known of his works is his chronicle from the creation to the capture of Rome by the Vandals in AD 455. Now the next saint is Saint Prosper, Bishop of Reggio, AD 466, with a question mark. There is evidence that from the 9th century, Saint Prosper, known as Bishop of Reggio, not the Reggio in Calabria, has been much venerated in the Italian province of the Emilia. He appears to have flourished in the 5th century, but history can tell us little that is definite about him. An unreliable tradition asserts that he distributed all his goods to the poor in order to fulfill our Lord's precept to the rich young man, and that he died on 25th of June 466 in the midst of his priests and deacons, after a beneficent episcopate which had lasted 22 years. He was buried in the church of St. Apollinaris, which he had built and consecrated outside the walls of Reggio. In the year 703, his relics were moved to a great new church erected in his honour by Thomas, Bishop of Reggio, and he is the principal patron of the city. The Roman Martyrology is here gravely at fault in that it identifies Prosper of Reggio with Prosper of Aquitaine above. The two were entirely distinct, and there is no trace of any attempt to identify them earlier than the 10th century. So they do come up a bit as mistakes. The next one is Saint Maximus. Yes, Saint Maximus, Bishop of Turin, AD 467. Much of the literary work of Saint Maximus of Turin survives, but very little is known about its writer. He appears to have been born about the year 380, and from inferences drawn from some of his writings, it is conjectured that he was a native either of Vercelli, or of some place in the province of Rahaitia. He states that in 397 he witnessed the martyrdom of 3 missionary bishops in Annonia in the Rahaitan Alps. The historian Gennadius, in the Book of Ecclesiastical Writers, which he compiled towards the end of the 5th century, describes Saint Maximus, Bishop of Turin, as a profound student of the Bible, a preacher well able to instruct the people, and the author of many books, the titles of some of which he specifies. The notice concludes by saying that Saint Maximus flourished in the reigns of Honorius and of Theodosius the Younger. As a matter of fact, he long survived them. In 451, he attended the Synod of Milan, presided over by his metropolitan, Saint Eusebius, and with the other prelates of northern Italy, he signed the letter addressed to Pope Saint Leo the Great, which declared the Assembly's adhesion to the orthodox doctrine of the Incarnation, as set forth in his so-called dogmatic epistle. Saint Maximus was also present at the Council of Rome in 465. His signature on that occasion follows immediately after that of Pope Saint Hilarius, and as precedence was then regulated by age. It is clear that he must have been a very old man. He is believed to have died shortly afterwards. A collection made of his reputed writings, as edited by Bruno Bruni in 1784, comprises some 116 sermons, 118 homilies, and 6 treatises. But this classification is very arbitrary. They are chiefly interesting for the light they throw on curious old customs and on the condition of the people of Lombardy at the time of the Gothic invasions. He mentions the destruction of Milan by Attila in one of his homilies. In another, which treats of the martyrs Octavius, Solutor, and Adventus, whose relics were preserved at Turin, he says, "All the martyrs are to be honoured by us, but especially those whose relics we possessed." Yes. They preserve us to our bodies in this life, and receive us when we depart hence. In 2 homilies on Thanksgiving, he inculcates the duty of daily giving praise to God, and recommends the Psalms as being a particularly suitable means to that end. No one, he insists, should ever omit morning and evening prayer or thanksgiving before and after every meal. Maximus exhorts all Christians to make the sign of the cross before every action, that by the sign of Jesus Christ, devoutly used, a blessing may be assured to us in all things. Dealing in one of his sermons with abuses in connection with New Year's Day, he depreciates the practice of giving presents to the well-off at that season without bestowing alms upon the poor, and denounces the hypocritical semblance of friendship in which the heart has no share. Elsewhere, he attacks heretics who sell the pardon of sins, whose pretended priests exacted money for absolving penitents instead of bidding them do penance and weep for their offences. See who else is on the list. Maximus, Bishop of Turin, we've just done. So let me see. Saint MOLOC of LUAN. Yeah, that's a strange name. Saint MOLOC or LUAN Bishop. And then it's Saint ADALBERT of EGMOND. So yes, we're nearly at the end of my named saints, so I will continue. Saint MOLOC or LUAN Bishop, AD 572, ? Saint Moluog or Murlac was formerly honoured throughout Scotland, and his widespread cultus may be traced in the numerous place names of which he is the eponym. Whether he was a native of Britain or of Ireland is still a moot point. However, the notice in the Aberdeen Breviary to the effect that he was of noble Scottish extraction and a native of Scotland seems to be borne out by an entry under the date of June 25th in the Feliere of Onigus. It runs Sinchel's feast, Teller's feast. They were heights of Ireland with Moloc pure, fair son of Lismore of Alba. The name of the saint's father was Lannion, and his own was originally Ludgaia, but it was modified to Moloc or Moluanus. In Ireland, where he received his education, he is said to have trained, at Birr under St. Brendan the Elder. At what date he returned to Scotland is not known. Landing in Argyllshire, he evangelized the inhabitants of Lismore in Loch Linhay after preaching at Tyler, wherever that may be, and visiting islands as far north as the Hebrides. I've been there. He appears to have devoted the rest of his life to missionary work in Ross and in the province of Mar. He died at Rossmarkie, probably about the year 572, but his relics were translated, that means moved, to Murlach. King Malcolm II attributed his victory over the Danes near Murlach to the intercession of Our Lady and Saint Murlach. As an act of thanksgiving, he founded in 1010 at Murlach, Mortlach, under their joint patronage, an abbey, a cathedral church, and an episcopal see. The bishopric was subsequently transferred to Aberdeen. He was apparently a bishop, and the Duke of Argyll claims to possess the bacul or crozier of St. Moloc, it having been for generations an heirloom in the family of Livingstone of Lismore. His feast under the form of his name LUAN is still observed in the Archdiocese of Argyll and the Isles. We are now reaching St. Adalbert of Egmond, AD 705 or after 714 is the question. So it still looks like there's a couple more. Amongst the band of missionaries who left the monastery of Rathmelsigi in 690 under the leadership of St. Willibrord to evangelize Friesland was a deacon named Adalbert. He was a Northumbrian and had followed St. Egbert to Ireland in order to obey our Lord's counsels of perfection. It was that same aspiration, coupled with a great love for souls, which prompted him to volunteer for missionary work among the heathen. The messengers of the gospel were assisted by the protection of Pepin of Herstal, and also by the fact that they found little difficulty in making themselves understood by the Frieslanders, but their personality had much to do with their ultimate success. Adalbert's gentleness, his patience, and his humility made a deep impression upon those to whom he brought the Christian faith. The nucleus of his activities were was EGMOND, and he converted the greater part of its inhabitants. It was perhaps out of humility that ADALBERT does not seem to have offered himself for the priesthood. St. Willibrord is said indeed to have appointed him Archdeacon of Utrecht, but an archdeacon in those days was simply a chief deacon, and St. Willibrord may well have wished to confer upon him some authority. St. Adalbert died in an unknown year. His tomb afterwards became a place of pilgrimage and the scene of many reported miracles. In the 10th century, Duke Theodoric built at EGMOND a Benedictine abbey dedicated under the name of this Adalbert, and when in recent times the Benedictines of Solesmes restored monastic life at Edgemond, the same titular was chosen. So here we are on the 8th century, Saint EUROSIA, Virgin and Martyr, 8th century. I'm just going to have a quick look and see who was the last written down. So I still have to do Saints Gothard, Bishop of Companions, Nantes, Martyrs. I am getting a bit tired, but I'm aware that I do want to finish the readings that I've written down in case I put them up by mistake. So we will continue. In a modern German essay entitled An Apocryphal Saint of the Late Middle Ages, its scholarly writer deals exhaustively and convincingly with Saint EUROSIA, and with the devotion of which she became the centre, first at Jaca in Spain, where it originated in the 15th century, and afterwards in Lombardy also. Father Delahaye, whose own conclusions coincided with those of the author, reviewing the treatise in the Analecta Bollandiana, says everything is suspect in the origins of this cultus, which was propagated in the north of Italy, thanks to the political relations between Spain and Lombardy. A considerable number of places in the Diocese of Como, my brother got married at Lake Como, it was beautiful, Cremona, Pavia and Navarra, possess chapels, altars, images and relics of Saint EUROSIA, who is honoured as the protector of the fruits of the field. Devotion to the new saint would seem to have been spread by Spanish soldiers and by the religious congregation of the Sumasci, whose headquarters were in the Diocese of Cremona. According to the popular tradition, EUROSIA was a noble maiden from the province of Bayonne, who at some time during the 8th century refused to marry a Moorish chieftain and was slain by the Saracens in the cavern to which she had fled for safety. Although relics reputed to be hers are preserved in Jaca Cathedral, it is not improbable that EUROSIA was an entirely fictitious character. She is invoked against bad weather. That's the end of that one. We're getting through. Saint Gohard, Bishop of Nantes, and his companions, their martyrs, AD 843. There's not many of them, so it won't take long, hopefully. The heathen Northmen who raided the coast of Anglo-Saxon England and of contemporary France seem especially to have singled out for attack religious foundations of all kinds. In so doing, they were animated partly by a hatred to the Christian faith, partly by the expectation of securing without serious opposition, this more like it, treasure belonging to the communities or entrusted to their care. So greedy people, if they met with disappointment or resistance, sometimes if they met with neither, they would destroy the buildings and massacre all connected with them. In the year 843, a number of Norman ships appeared at the mouth of the LUAN and were piloted up the river by a traitor named Lambert, who had aspired to the countship of Nantes, but had been driven out by the citizens. Great was the alarm felt by the inhabitants when the foreigners reached Nantes. The monks of a neighbouring monastery carried their ecclesiastical treasure into the church of Saints Peter and Paul, where GOHARD the bishop was actually engaged in celebrating the feast of the birthday of St. John the Baptist. Although the sacred edifice was filled with people who had fled there for safety, the Northmen broke down the doors and windows. Forcing their way to the altar, they slew St. GOHARD just as he had reached Sursum Corda at the beginning of the preface, and the priests who surrounded him were killed by his side. The monks also were murdered. After setting fire to the church, the barbarians kidnapped the leading citizens, setting a ransom upon their heads. Before they finally retired, they had pillaged the whole city. The body of St. GOHARD was rescued, and his relics were taken to Angers, his native town. What a horrible story. I'm glad I haven't got to finish with that. I've got Blessed Henry Zeddik. It's Z-D-I-K, Bishop of Olomouc, A.D. 1150. Although Bishop Henry Zeddik's cultus has never been officially approved, yet the great services he rendered to the Church in his own diocese and beyond it have caused him to be honoured as a beatus in what is now known as Czechoslovakia. He is said to have been closely connected with the rulers of Bohemia, but what the relationship actually was is a contested point. All that seems certain about his origin is that he was born in Moravia. In 1126, he became a bishop of Olomouc, and under his auspices, Duke Wenceslas I undertook the rebuilding of the cathedral. The completion and decoration of the basilica were the bishop's own doing. In 1137 or 1138, Blessed Henry made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. While he was there, he took the Premonstratensian habit and experienced a spiritual awakening, which, in the words of his biographer, led him to return home. A new man. His zeal for the church now expressed itself in various ways. In 1141, he joined a mission or crusade to convert the Prussians, with what result we are not told. 2 years later, we find him associated with others in founding the Abbey of Stranhove. He entitled it Mount Zion and brought it to Premonstratensians from Steinfeld near Cologne. At a later date, he restored the monastery of Litomeris, of which he was reckoned the second founder. To this community he gave another name reminiscent of his Palestinian pilgrimage. He called it Mount Olivet. The difficulty he found in bringing his clergy back to regular observance, and especially in enforcing rule of celibacy, decided him to go to Rome to confer with the Pope. Scarcely had he started, however, when he was set upon by would-be assassins, from whose hands he barely escaped with his life. He made no second attempt, for it was rendered unnecessary by the timely arrival in Bohemia of a papal legate, who gave him the support and authority he required to enable him to carry out his reforms. Blessed Henry Zidek died in 1150 or 1151 and was buried at Strahov, a monastery that still exists. So now we've got Blessed John the Spaniard, AD 1160. Oh, praise the Lord, that is the last one. There are more, but I'm not going to do them because I'll just do what I've written down. Although there is one name that should be there on that same date, because we're on June 26th. But I'll do St. John, the Blessed John rather, the Spaniard. This John was born in 1123, probably at Almanza in Leon. He was a studious boy, and at the age of 13 he went to France with a companion to seek the educational advantages he could not obtain nearer home. The two lads made their way to Arles, where they found excellent teachers, but where they were occasionally reduced to great straits. Later, however, John was befriended by a wealthy man who took him to live in his own house. His studies completed, John bade farewell to his kind friends and took himself to a hermit under whom he trained for 2 years and a half. He then obtained admittance to the Carthusian priory of MARTYR or Mons-Rivi, and from the moment he entered the novitiate, he set himself to tread faithfully in the footsteps of Saint Bruno. For 6 years he set himself to tread faithfully in the footsteps of Bruno. He filled the office of the sacristan, and afterwards he was chosen to be prior. In that capacity he strove to encourage learning, and with his own hand copied and corrected manuscripts, from which last activity it may be judged he was a man of strong nerves. At the close of his tenure of office, which he appears to have resigned, he was transferred to the Grand Chartreuse. St. Anselm, who was then the superior of that great monastery, held him in very high esteem, and when Hamo de Fulciano asked that some Carthusians might be sent to make a foundation on one of his estates near the Lake of Geneva, St. Anselm selected Blessed John to go as their prior. Not without considerable difficulty was this new charter house started, but once it was established, it was called Reposoir, from the atmosphere of peace that pervaded it. Another work John performed at the request of St. Anselm was the compilation of a constitution for Carthusian nuns. After ruling the community of Reposa for 9 years, Blessed John died in the year 1160. By his expressed desire, he was interred beside 2 shepherds who had been killed by an avalanche and whom he had buried. A chapel was built over his tomb, but in 1649 his remains were moved to the sacristy of the monastery church. This was done by Charles Augustus de Sales, Bishop of Geneva, the nephew of St. Francis de Sales, and the formal instrument drawn up by him with a description of what occurred is still preserved. Blessed John's cultus was confirmed in 1864. And the final saint, I can't leave it out, is Blessed Guy Marimaldi, AD 1391. There are other saints, but the date is 26, so I'm not going there, because there's always more than one, and I can't do any more after this last one. Blessed Guy Marimaldi, AD 1391. Oh, I love the Dominicans. Among the Dominicans who preached and taught in Italy during the second half of the 14th century, Guy Marimaldi deserves a prominent place. Oh, and I nearly didn't record him. He came of a Neapolitan family, and each of his 3 brothers, like himself, was a man of mark. Guy was still a mere stripling when he presented himself at the Neapolitan House of the Order of Preachers and asked for the habit. His request was granted after some hesitation, due to the fear that his delicate upbringing would unfit him for the stern discipline of a friary. The apprehension proved groundless, and in his austerities and obedience, as well as his studies, he soon outstripped his fellow novices. In later life, he became a great theologian and preacher. After teaching theology and philosophy at Naples, he went to Ragusa, where the success of his preaching and his fame as a wonder worker caused him to be acclaimed as an apostle. Upon his return home, he was appointed Inquisitor General for the Kingdom of Naples, a post which brought him on several occasions into serious danger. He died in the year 1391, and his cultus was approved in 1612. That's the final saint, and we've reached 1 hour 13 minutes or so, maybe slightly over by the time I say good night. Good night and God bless. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sending you the peace of Christ, and may you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. So I will probably record when I come home from the Latin Mass tomorrow, but I won't be doing so much tomorrow because I feel really tired after this holiday. I've been on holiday all week. At home on holiday, going out every day, but it was delightful going to the beaches and just sitting there in the sun. It really was nice. God bless. Sending you the peace of Christ. Thank you for listening and sharing. God bless. Bye-bye.